challenges that I've found, and these are three things that are just endemic in public institutions. I'm not proposing that there's a good answer to this. It's the way we run public institutions. It's by definition what a public institution is. But these challenges make leadership in these sorts of organizations very, very difficult. So challenge number one, your primary oversight board is an elected legislative body which oversees the agency, but has a consistently different agenda than the agency itself, okay? In fact, the legislative oversight body often doesn't know very much about the agency and its details and what it does. And the result of that is not only do you spend an enormous amount of time explaining yourself to the people who set your budgets and have to run you, but that oftentimes very strange things happen. And it is not unusual to see legislative bodies do things that cause enormous upset inside agencies with no consultation and very little knowledge of what they're doing. So let me give you two war stories here. When I was at Commerce, I think it was my first budget while I was deputy secretary, we got the markup from the Hill. And the markup from the Hill had this very strange thing in it. It canceled out a quarter of our budget and moved most of the Weather Service satellites over to NASA. Now, a quarter of our budget was Weather Service. Satellites turned out to be very expensive. So, and we had no idea this was going to happen. No one talked to us. It turns out a very powerful senator had decided that we shouldn't be overseeing Weather Service satellites. And since NASA is the space agency, they should. Now, the problem with that is we, of course, don't build our satellites. We contract out with other people who build the satellites. And what the proposal essentially was, and you tell me if you think this is a good idea, was that NASA was going to have the entire responsibility to design and create the satellites. And then they turned them over to the Weather Service, and the Weather Service was the one that had to operate and deliver on the satellites. And there was no connection here, as the way this was set up, between the people doing the design and the people who actually had the responsibility for delivering. And, we sort of thought that was a bad idea at Commerce. I spent 2 years of my life trying to undo that, and we finally got it done about the time that I walked out of the deputy secretary job. But it was an enormous internal upset in the agency. It was enormous amounts of time and energy from all of the leadership in the agency, basically getting us back to where we'd been before. Similar example in Wisconsin, and I had a number of faculty in Wisconsin saying, I've never seen anything like this before, and I said, oh yeah, I have. So in the midst of our budget debate last year, at the very end of the budget debate, the Wisconsin legislature, with no consultation, without any discussion, decided to change everything around tenure at the university, and not just at us, but across the whole system. And again, because we're a state agency, this is very unusual. Tenure provisions were written into state law. There's almost, I don't know that there's any other school in the country for whom that's true. So they dropped them out of state law and said the regions have to deal with this. And the regions, to give them credit, within a few days had adopted tenure statutes. That was not the problem, though that did cause upset. The problem was then, because you had a whole bunch of state employees, these tenured faculty, who were not covered by anything in state law, you needed to put something in state law to cover them. So they took the language around general staff and dumped it in and applied it to tenured faculty. And it turns out the language around how you dismiss and deal with general staff is not appropriate for tenured faculty. You can't dismiss tenured faculty in the same ways that you can dismiss just a general state employee. So that has caused enormous upset. We're still in the midst of writing the rules and regulations around what we will do in the face of that change in state law. I think this is almost done. I think we've settled it, but I can't tell you how much internal upset and angst and time and energy has gone into what I think is going to be getting us back to a set of tenure statutes that are pretty close to where we were before, okay? And the bottom line here is that legislators as oversight bodies know little about your agency. They can do anything. They will do some things, and never expect them to consult with you. And that makes it challenging to be in leadership. Always interesting, right? It's problem number one. Problem number two, an incredible number of stakeholders, all of whom think they have a voice in what you're doing. So at the University of Wisconsin, I've got 43,000 students, 19,000 staff, 3,000 faculty, 400,000 alums, 33 state senators, 99 assembly members, 1 governor, 18 cabinet agencies, 10 federal agencies who give us major funding and who have extensive regulations on us, 14 members of our governing board of regents, the entire local community, and all state citizens in the state of Wisconsin. They all think they have valid input, and most of them do, into how we operate. And I can promise you it is utterly impossible to please most of those people most of the time. Someone is going to be unhappy, and oftentimes a lot of people are unhappy. So that creates huge problems of communication, of who do you talk to and when do you talk to them and what message do you convey. And of course, because all of those groups have different agendas, those messages often don't fit very well together. And you've often got problems that if I go up to the state legislature and I tell them this budget is dreadful, it will destroy the university, you've got to do something about it, I can't quite say that, because if I say that to the state legislature, everybody back home on campus is going to hear that, and people are going to start thinking, gosh, the budget's dreadful, Wisconsin's in trouble, I better go get an outside offer. And so you always have to be modulating your messages towards multiple audiences at the same time. And that is a major problem. Problem number 3, everything public agencies do is done in the glare of media and attention. The media are always looking for gotcha stories, and what's better than big public agencies to find a gotcha story? So at the University of Wisconsin, as I mentioned, we have 43,000 students and 22,000 staff and faculty on campus pretty much every week. I promise you right now, at this very moment, there are several people on that campus doing things that are very bad, right? And someone's going to find them out, and they're going to be on the front page of the paper. And you're going to hear all about them if you live in Madison or if you live in the state of Wisconsin. You will hear nothing about the other 64,995 who are doing their job. But you will hear a lot about the 2 or 3 who got in trouble. And that's a problem. We had the same issue with commerce. When we ran the census, this is, imagine this. In the course of 1 year, we hired 650,000 people. That's a major company, right? We trained them, we put them to work, and we laid them off. It was a huge undertaking. Of those 650,000 people, we made mistakes, very clear mistakes, in 2 cases. Guess what everyone heard about, right, in the census? And that type of attention, and the social media, of course, makes all of this worse, because half of what's in the paper is wrong as well as it comes to social media. It's one of my arguments as to why trust in public institutions is so low, because you only hear the bad news. You never hear about the 64,995 people who are doing their job and doing it well. And indeed, there's no mechanism to get that out. I'll come back and talk about that in a minute. It does make it very hard to defend these agencies, because people have this long list of stories they've heard, which account for about 4 or 5 things that happened last year, as opposed to the thousands of things your agency did. So those are the sorts of problems that make leadership, I might say, very challenging. Now, the trouble is, the easy thing to do in these organizations is just keep them running, right? Just keep doing what you've always been doing. Don't make waves. Keep your head down. Try not to get in front of any of those stakeholders unless you have to. But unfortunately, we're in a very rapidly changing world. It's true of commerce. It's even more true of higher education. Higher education, in part, is interesting right now because there's so many changes happening about what universities are doing, what tools we have, what techniques we're using, what demands are being placed on us. And you can't simply keep doing business as usual if you're going to maintain your quality and your presence. So you've got to be dealing with the question of how do you change these really big public organizations? And I can promise you that's hard. The outside stakeholders will attack. There'll be always someone who attacks any change, and there'll always be some inside stakeholders who attack every change. Most people are much more comfortable with keeping things going as they are. So the biggest question that I think I've confronted in these organizations is, how do you implement change? And what do you do inside these big organizations to make things move forward? And I'll give you I think I've got my 7 lessons that I've learned about implementing change. Number 1, communication, communication, communication. Communicating is absolutely key to everything you do, both outside and inside the organization. If there's anything that sits more centrally on the agenda and the plate of the person who's at the top of the organization, it's being both the external communicator about the organization and the internal communicator to the organization about how the world around is in turn impinging them. Explaining what's changing, explaining what has to change, putting out a vision for where we could be, talking about how we get there. All of that is really, really important, and you spend an enormous amount of time at it. And if you don't do that well, you might as well give up on anything else because you won't get any other change done. Number 2, the process really matters. Many of you know this. You've worked inside all sorts of different, it's true in any organization. top-down change announced from the leader is almost surely the worst thing you can possibly do. What you have to do is go through a process of consultation. You've got an awful lot of stakeholders, and they need to hear about what's happening. And I got to know the Deputy Secretary in the Department of Defense pretty well for a couple of years while I was there, and we would have these conversations about change. And even in the military, I will tell you, the Deputy Secretary there would say top-down change is not how you make anything really change. You've got to go through consultation. You've got to get people's input. So, my idea of the ideal change process, and this takes time, which is a problem because you don't always have it, is, you get a group together. You talk about a problem, you suggest some solutions, you get them to go think about it. They come back with a pretty broad outline of here's some things we can do. You put that outline out into the organization. You get feedback from all across the organization. You learn a whole lot. You take that feedback together with the collaborative group. You put together a very specific proposal. You send it back. You get all sorts of feedback on that specific proposal. You come back, you learn a whole lot, you change it, and then you start implementing. And you go through that process again in the implementation. You want to hear what's working and what isn't. If you've got a year or two to get something done, that's the process you follow. If you don't have a year or two to get something done, you're in much bigger trouble because you can't go through that type of consultation. But the process always matters, and being as transparent and as consultative as possible, it's not always possible, but trying to do that when you can matters. Number 3, you're always in a public promotional campaign for your institution. The minute you step outside the door every morning, you are in a public promotional campaign for your institution because no one else is telling the good news. They're only reading the front page of the paper about those 2 or 3 people who did something wrong yesterday. And of course, you yourself can't be the sole promotional person for the entire institution. So you've got to be about organizing those stakeholders, whichever ones will be with you on any issue, to speak for you and to speak for the institution and to speak about the good things that it's doing. And whether that's your alumni or whether that's the business community or whether that's your students or the faculty, when you can, you've just got to always realize everybody on the outside who isn't a stakeholder is going to only be interested in the bad news. They're playing gotcha games. And you've got to play another game where you constantly get the good news out and talk about what's happening, what you're doing well, where you're going, why that's important, how you're surviving, and even more, how you're thriving. The worst thing you can do is start talking about all the problems inside an institution when you go out and talk to groups, because that will kill your institution faster than anything, because that's all they hear from anyone else. And if you start saying it, that's all they will know. So you're always in a promotional campaign. That's item number 3. Item number 4, and universities, I think, don't understand this. You need the best possible communications team. One of the biggest advantages I had before coming to Wisconsin is I had worked inside the federal government. And in the federal government, in those agencies, they understand that you need the best possible communications team. You've always got stuff coming at you. While I was the undersecretary working with the census, I ran what we called our rapid response team. And there was a group inside Census that tracked every possible mention of the census. In 2000, there were 5 reporters who covered the census. And tracking the problems meant pulling those 5 reporters into the director's office about once every month and talking to them about what was happening. In 2010, there were tens of thousands of people on social media discussing the census. And you've got to be in front of that. And I learned more in that 6 months of running that rapid response team about how you get in front of media stories, when you wait, when you don't wait, what you do to get out in front, how important you've got in responding in social media is. So best lesson, of all the things that I knew coming into Wisconsin, that experience was probably my most useful. And hiring the best set of communications teams that know how to respond to that. I didn't have that when I walked into Wisconsin. I think I've got it now, or I've got a much better one. And boy, is that important. So that's item number 4. Number 5 about change. Whenever you, I've actually already said this in another way, don't let the challenges eat up all your time. It's not just when you're talking publicly, but you will, all of the things that come to you are usually the problems, right? The things that are going well, nobody ever takes up to the leader. Those are being handled inside the organization. And you can't let the problems define what the job is that you do. Because if there's really changes that need to happen, if you've got a vision for where an organization has to go, you've got to move that vision forward. And moving that vision forward does not involve just dealing with the problems. It means actually moving things forward, right? And one of the best things that I did, I think, my first year in the organization, it was a challenge in some ways, is my husband and my daughter stayed behind in Maryland because my daughter was a senior in high school. So I flew home every weekend. And that gave me 2 hours on a plane going out and 2 hours on a plane coming back to Madison to figure out what I was doing that week. And that gave me time to sit down and think about what are my agendas, what do I need to accomplish this week, what do I need to accomplish this month, what do I want to accomplish in my first year, and what do I have to do this week to move that forward. And since I'm no longer commuting, I actually have to really work to make time in my schedule to sit down every week and say, what is the agenda? What do I need to accomplish this week to get done what needs to be done this month? What do I need to do this month to get done what needs to be done next year? And not being caught up in the day-to-day crises, because there are a lot of them, and constantly keeping your head above water to think about those bigger changes and what you have to do with them, which I never do as much of as I should, is really important. Item number 6 for change. You cannot spend too much time building relationships with key people, whether that's legislators or other oversight bodies such as the Board of Regents, whether that's your senior faculty, whether that's your alumni. Relationships at the end of the day are what often moves organizations forward. Having the right process matters, but people have to trust you, they have to know you, and that's all about relationships. So, you know, I do have a number of people in and outside of Wisconsin who think that the way that one should deal with a recalcitrant legislature is go down and protest in front of their offices. And I can promise you that is probably the worst response to a legislator who's trying to do something that you think is harmful to the university, because then you will be punished, right? What you need to do is make sure that legislature knows you and that the lines of communication are open. This doesn't always work, but if you possibly can, you want to build a relationship and make sure you can talk back and forth. And the next time something hits or some odd idea strikes someone's brain, rather than just going and doing it, they might actually call you and talk to you first, and that's really important. And finally, my last comment about change. Change is possible, but you need 3 things. You have to be patient, you have to be persistent, and you have to be nimble. And Ron actually mentioned patient, and you get a lot of things done if you keep them in the front of your mind for a long period of time and keep pushing on them, right? And the poverty measure was one of those. I worked on that through 3 different administrations, and finally, something moved forward. But nothing changes fast. You need a long-term time horizon. It's why short-term turnover in senior leadership positions inside of public organizations is so devastating. There's no long-term agendas. There's no one moving change forward. When the University of Missouri president gets fired after a year, that just sets the university back by 2 years. And so you have to be patient. You have to be willing to play a long-term game. You'll get set behind you. There's a lot of things you think won't happen, but if you keep working on them, it's amazing how much you can get done. Number 2, beyond patience, you have to be persistent. You have to keep repeating things. Why the change is necessary? What's your vision for addressing it? How is this going to affect the organization? How should people themselves be involved in it? What's the expected timeline? What are the plans for implementation? How will this change make the institution better? And why should people be on board with it? And you have to say that every time you open your mouth with an appropriate stakeholder, again and again and again, because most people, most of the time, aren't listening, right? And if you don't say it 10 times, they aren't going to hear it. Maybe you have to say it 20 times. And so patience, persistence. And then lastly, you've got to be nimble, because persistence doesn't mean stubborn. You've got to keep looking for ways to make things happen. And you can't have a single model in your mind that says, we have to do it just this way. And I'm going to, because if you're doing that, I can promise you it won't happen. You've got to be flexible about what it is you'll accept and how you move an agenda forward. And sometimes you end up doing something entirely different than what you thought 2 to 3 years ago you were actually going to do, but it accomplishes what you want to accomplish. And I'm a strong believer that getting 75% of what you want by compromising and moving things forward is far preferable to getting 0. And for that, you've got to always be nimble, and at the same time, you're persistent, be thinking and changing and responding to the environment around you so that something actually can move forward. At the end of the day, I will tell you these jobs are hard. This current job is probably the hardest job I've ever had in my life. Having said that, I remember when I was dean at the Ford School, Bob Axelrod, one of our very prominent faculty, we had lunch together in my 2nd year or so, and he looked at me and he said, Becky, you were really a good researcher and a great academic, and I know how much you love teaching. Why would you ever want to be dean? And I looked back at him and I said what I thought was true then, and I would say even more now. It is really intellectually interesting and exciting to work inside a big organization and figure out what the levers are and how you move things and how you change things and how you respond to crises. That takes a level of intellectual engagement and serious thought that, in my experience, is far harder than anything I ever did as a researcher. And the rewards from it, when you actually make that happen, and you see something occur that you think is worthwhile, and I might say many of the people around you will not think it was worthwhile at all. They'll still be complaining about the change. So you've got to really believe that that was a worthwhile thing to do. That reward is worth something, and worth all of the effort and the energy and the years that you put on it. I will also note that if you're easily bored, these are jobs that keep you on your toes. Things come at you differently every day. And then, lastly, I would say that one of the things that I really like about this job, and it's a challenge, but it's an enormously fun opportunity at times, is we're at a particular moment in time. If you lead higher education, if you lead a big federal agency, you can never take for granted that anyone is going to agree on what you're doing and why you're doing it and what the value of the organization is. Now, that can be very discouraging on some days, but it means that you actually have to figure out, you and your leaders and others in the organization, how to articulate what your mission is, what the value of the university is, why you're out there and why you're doing what you do. And being forced to articulate that every day is actually a really good discipline. It's one of the reasons why I very much believe the publics contribute more to society than the privates. If you look at universities, and now I know I'm treading on some very serious ground here, but at the University of Wisconsin, we have always been forced to be at the forefront of every public debate because we're a public, because the legislature sits right down the street from us, because we are a state university and a state agency. And that forces us to be much more engaged in the world and immediately relevant to the state